Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Keddy from Deakin University. Welcome to Building Just Futures Through Education. This showcase brings together a group of researchers whose work is helping us to think about what it really means to create fairer and more sustainable futures through education. At Deakin's Faculty of Arts and Education, we're all about tackling big justice questions in education. How can we make learning and schooling more inclusive, equitable and responsive to the challenges of our time? And how can education itself be a force for building more just futures? In this short video, you'll hear from researchers whose projects speak powerfully to these questions. They're exploring the social justice implications of public school funding inequities here in Australia and the ways climate change is fundamentally an intergenerational justice issue for young people. You'll also hear about research that examines the current challenges of international education and a project that focuses on developing community-based wellbeing metrics that make sense across different contexts and demographics. These projects capture what Deakin Education research is all about. Research that matters, that partners with communities, and that works towards building just futures through education.
My work focuses on developing community health and wellbeing measures that are meaningful and accessible across different contexts, environments, and demographics. Too often, vulnerable populations have been harmed by measurement systems, standardized metrics that were once weaponized to justify displacement, exclusion, and even genocide. This history has created deep and justified skepticism towards data and evaluation processes. Yet, reliable metrics are essential. They enable government and non-government organizations to identify and respond to emerging community threats and to evaluate the real impact of their programs. Without credible data, effective policy and humanitarian action are impossible. In 2021, I established a research practice partnership that now connects over 500 civil society organizations worldwide. This year, our founding partner, the Centre for Conflict Resolution in Uganda, hosted representatives from the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict and Deakin for a 3-day workshop in Kampala. Our goal was to finalise our approach to capacity building and social cohesion through what I call standardised customisation, using consistent measurement frameworks that can be locally adapted. Current reputable metrics fail to accurately reflect communities not aligned to Western norms. Unemployment rate, for example, may be a reasonable representation of how well a community may access resources in a Western society, whereas this rate is effectively meaningless when applied to communities with few working in the formal economy. The idea is to allow communities to generate their own data, identify their priorities, and design interventions that reflect their lived realities, while still contributing to global comparability metrics. Our partners were involved with the framework design, providing pragmatic insights beyond those published in academic literature, to best understand how such a framework may be sustainably adopted across contexts, and to ensure it is accessible to varied populations. Greater consultation was sought as to the feasibility and applicability within the Ugandan context. The workshop brought together representatives from 5 Ugandan government departments, including the National Curriculum Development Centre, the equivalent of Australia's Federal Department of Education, and the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. Sessions were co-led by university, government and civil society organisational representatives. One session explored how on-the-ground peace builders may adapt context-relevant indicators towards the framework. An example provided was how they could gauge how secure a community felt based on the proportion of men who slept while wearing shoes, to be ready to react at a moment's notice. Another explored the considerations to launch and maintain the initiative within Uganda from a resourcing and responsibility perspectives. Who would fund this? Why would they fund this? Who would be responsible for the varied roles? How would this be best integrated into current legislative and political considerations? How can we ensure that these new capabilities are used for the public benefit? All questions we continue to explore and develop with our local partners. Together, we are building the foundations for a shared framework that empowers communities to define, monitor, and meet their own needs. Only when people have access to trusted, locally relevant information can they take ownership of their futures. Our next step is to pilot this framework across Uganda and Australia, advancing our shared vision of evidence-based peace building and social cohesion.
My research explores how international education can support a more equitable and inclusive future. The problem I focus on is the continuous dominance of Western perspective in international education. Even though there are many calls to make education more inclusive and decolonized, we still know too little about how this can be achieved in practice in international education. I focus on reverse student mobility, Australian students studying in the Indo-Pacific through the New Colombo Plan, or NCP. I was motivated to see how these study abroad programs can challenge traditional power relations, shift our perception on non-Western regions like the Indo-Pacific, and strengthen regional connection. The NCP represents a turning point. Prior to the NCP, Australian students prefer to study in Anglophone countries like the US, UK, Canada. But since the introduction of the NCP in 2014, around half of Australian study abroad students have gone to the Indo-Pacific region. Formerly colonized countries once seen as less traditional study abroad destinations, including Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, PNG, and Fiji, are now important learning spaces for Australian students. These experiences encourage mutual learning and recognition of Indo-Pacific as a source of knowledge, innovation, and cultural richness. This shift has great symbolic potential to decolonize international education. However, symbolic change alone is not enough. To be genuinely transformative, programs like the NCP must go further, questioning Eurocentric assumptions, addressing inequities in access and participation in mobility, and embedding more inclusive and reflexive teaching and learning practices in study abroad programs. Without this, international education could reproduce the same hierarchies it seeks to challenge. Our research includes a survey of more than 1,300 students and 298 interviews with people in Australia and across the Indo-Pacific. We found that well-designed mobility programs can help students move beyond stereotypes and better understanding the creativity, strength, and diversity of the Indo-Pacific communities. Importantly, host communities play an active role in shaping these experiences, showing that exchange is a two-way process. To build fairer and more meaningful partnerships, we can work more closely with Indo-Pacific partners, including local host communities, to co-design programs, share more clearly what the NCP aims to achieve, especially in terms of enhancing Indo-Pacific capabilities for young Australians, and strengthening regional understanding and engagement so that both Australian and regional partners understand its purpose and values. Support students after they return home, helping them apply what they have learned and continue engaging with the region. Balance the benefit of NCP programs across student learning, national capacity building, education diplomacy, and regional cooperation. Learn from successful examples of building just and equitable student mobility programs in other parts of the world.
My research focuses on the role of public education and issues related to public education, such as school funding, segregation, and school choice. My recent project studied venture philanthropy in public education, interviewing philanthropists, teachers, and public school principals in thinking about the role of competitive grants coming into public schools. It highlighted a significant issue of precarity, public school principals working really hard for competitive funding, also underfunding and lack of fair resourcing. The justice problem that my research looks at is economic inequality, but also social inequality. Unfair funding of public schools leads to multi-layered dimensions of injustice, and this form of injustice creates hurdles, exclusions, and disadvantages, and contributes to a lack of social mobility for particular groups of young people. We need to have a vibrant, robustly funded public school sector, and this is critical for social mobility in that young people should be able to access a wide variety of career paths, irrespective of their background or family wealth. So every young person should be able to access the best football pitch or the best science laboratories, regardless of their family wealth or where they come from. We have a problem in Australia right now in that we are subsidising and funding industries at the expense of our public school system. For example, we are actively subsidising the fossil fuel industry. Government funding of the fossil fuel industry has actually increased, whereas our real funding of public schools is decreasing. And this disinvestment of public education is actually a disinvestment from young people and their futures. There are many steps we can take to improve the funding of our public school system. And I think in order to understand it, we actually have to understand that we have three sources of funding, and that is recurrent funding, capital funding, and private funding. And recurrent funding is our student-based funding, and that is our only needs-based funding. So that is calculated according to the Schooling Resource Standard. It's often called the SRS. And recurrent funding is the only source of funding that is tied to a needs-based measure. While we have a lot of arguments that our funding system is adequate because it is needs-based, this is only linked to one form of funding, and it excludes two other really substantial forms of funding, which is capital and private. Capital funding is for school buildings, libraries, infrastructure, gymnasiums, rugby fields, football pitches, swimming pools, things like that is capital funding. And that is such a significant issue in our school funding system. It really stands out as one of the biggest problems we have. Our capital funding is ad hoc, so it's not tied to any needs-based measure. It is inconsistent, uneven, and this was highlighted a really long time ago in the 2011 Gonski report. So private schools actually receive capital funding from both federal and state government, whereas public schools only receive capital funding from the state. We have recently introduced one-off federal grants for public schools, but this does not get rid of the history of capital funding for public schools being very deficit-based and not being enough. So we really need to fix capital funding. The issue as well is we have private forms of funding from families, and this is incredibly uneven. It is also really, really high in Australia, our private forms of funding. So if we compare our private forms of funding, a typical household in Australia will contribute 21% to secondary school, whereas the norm is only 9%. So we really do stand out as having much higher forms of private funding for secondary schools in particular. And that is not good for equity in that every family has different forms of funding that they can contribute, so it really is uneven and inequitable. So our private forms of funding actually need to be regulated and capped, and they should affect government funding. So if a private school is charging tuition fees that are higher than the cap, it should affect their government funding. So we need to have some kind of regulation around private forms of funding, tied to a needs-based measure as well.
My work addresses the nexus of economic exploitation and political disenfranchisement amongst young people. Young people are increasingly employed in precarious and alienating jobs, which in turn gives them a precarious and marginal position in public life, and disenfranchises them as citizens in a society where good citizenship is often regarded as synonymous with economic productivity. They're also starting side hustles, combining entrepreneurship with paid employment. I've interviewed young people who combine full-time work with side hustles in e-commerce, digital content creation, or even baking, all in the hope of realising their passions and enhancing their economic security. However, despite a cultural context that celebrates entrepreneurship in this competitive and precarious context, side hustles are typically not profitable and are only sustainable for those with financial support from elsewhere. In this context, the burden of precarity is unevenly distributed and places additional demands on young women, socioeconomically disadvantaged young people, and migrants. However, I've also shown that young people respond to this with forms of solidarity and community building that are unrecognisable from the perspectives that we usually use to think about citizenship and politics. This problem matters now because today's generation of young people is growing up in an era where the traditional promises of education and effort no longer guarantee stability or progress. The normalisation of insecure work and the glorification of entrepreneurialism mask the structural inequalities that determine who thrives and who struggles. These patterns reproduce hierarchies and inequalities, while simultaneously moralising youth identities around resilience and self-reinvention. In this context, I suggest that creating more just futures requires reimagining employment as a pathway to a secure and fulfilling existence. This pathway has eroded over time, but young people are heavily invested in the idea of themselves as workers, and they are asking for work that is fulfilling and that offers them a valued place in society. That means we need social and economic policies that value care, service, and creative labour as essential to community life, rather than as disposable or marginal. Justice demands not only fairer pay and security, but also recognition of the impact that precarious work has on people's lives. It means providing collective structures, education, welfare, and labour protections that enable young people to participate in public life as citizens whose ideas and relationships matter. My work invites policymakers, educators, and communities to challenge neoliberal logics and design economies grounded in dignity, equality, and shared prosperity.
Climate change is a justice issue. While rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and biodiversity loss impact everyone, the burden is not shared equally. Those first and worst affected by climate impacts are often those who've done the least to contribute to climate change. Climate impacts magnify and deepen existing injustices experienced by individuals and communities along intersectional axes, including gender, class, indigeneity, racialisation, sexuality, disability and age. For children and young people, climate change is an intergenerational injustice. They are inheriting the weight of its social, economic and political impacts into the future. It's a curricular injustice when some young people do not have the opportunity to explore what climate justice might look, sound and feel like in their local community and beyond. The Striking Voices project is an intersectional, transgenerational project where young people are the experts by experience of their climate justice advocacy, activism and education. Natasha Abewick-Rama, Sophie Chu, Neda Moyava and Danny Villafania are research associates on the project. Everyone has been 18 to 24 years old and climate organisers as well. The project is seeking to document and amplify the work and experiences of young climate organisers in recent years, and to consider the role of mainstream school education in the just transition. For the young people who've been involved in this project, climate justice means addressing the structural and historical causes of current injustices and preserving, revitalising and learning from the deep histories, traditional knowledges and cultural practices of First Peoples who have cared for country since time immemorial. Climate justice also means critically interrogating what and who is obstructing meaningful climate action. Climate justice means crafting energy solutions that do not leave anyone behind and that create communities where all can thrive. The young people who we've spoken to over the last 4 years have stressed the value for them of educational opportunities to analyse the unjust root causes of climate change and to consider what is needed for a just transition. They've expressed the need to give voice to the overlapping emotions about climate change and to forge transgenerational solidarities, including with teachers and community members, and to take collective action. In responding, mitigating and adapting to climate change, young people's climate justice work needs to be taken seriously, especially the work of First Nations young people of Pacifica and migrant backgrounds, and young people in historical mining communities. Young people need more equitable access to climate justice education, including removing the curricular influence of fossil fuel companies in educational programs and schools. Young people in this project have called for embodied, affective and intellectually rich modes of education that cross traditional subject boundaries, that connect climate change with young people's lived experiences, identities and local global injustices, and that foster intersectional solidarities in challenging times.
Thank you for watching Building Just Futures Through Education. These projects remind us that research isn't just about generating knowledge. It's about shaping change. Each of these studies shows how education can be a powerful force for justice, inclusion and hope. At Deakin's Faculty of Arts and Education, we're proud to support research that makes a difference, work that helps build fairer futures for all.